Metroid is one of those series that people talk about like it's nearly perfect. These games are constantly praised for inventing a genre, but that doesn't automatically mean they're still fun to play, especially decades later, and that also doesn't mean that modern entries are flawless. So let's actually go through the 2D Metroid games and figure out which ones earn their reputation and which ones get a little too much credit for being important instead of enjoyable. Before Metroid even exists as a game, you have to look at where Nintendo was in the mid-1980s. Most of their games were pretty much progressing from point A to point B, or simple arcade high-score type games. This was shown most clearly with Nintendo's biggest success at the time, the original Super Mario Bros. It was just about constant forward momentum and readable design. So when Nintendo R&D1 started experimenting with the idea of a game that didn't push you forward, didn't clearly explain itself, and didn't even guarantee you were going the right way, that wasn't some obvious slam dunk concept. Metroid was born out of a strange mix of influences, the loneliness and tension of sci-fi movies like Alien, the exploration focus of The Legend of Zelda which came out the same year, and a deliberate desire to make a game that felt isolating. Yoshio Sakamoto and Gunpei Yokoi weren't trying to make the most accessible NES game on the shelf, but they wanted to make a game where there was a feeling of being small, alone, and trespassing somewhere hostile. And that intent does matter, because a lot of what Metroid does well and a lot of what it does poorly comes directly from that philosophy. When Metroid released in Japan in 1986 and North America in 1987, it immediately stood out. You boot it up, and instead of cheerful music or a clear objective, you're met with eerie, minimal sound design, and a quiet descent onto planet Zebes. Samus starts with almost nothing, just a basic arm cannon and a jump that already feels a little questionable, and the game makes no attempt to explain itself. There's no map, no tutorial, no real indication of where you should go first, and that was of course very intentional. Metroid wanted players to feel lost. The entire arc of the game is about growth, not just in terms of weapons, but understanding the space you're occupying. The idea was that as you explored, Zebes would slowly stop feeling like a maze and start feeling like a place you understood. And I think conceptually it's a great goal, and it is the foundation of everything the series becomes later. The core structure still holds up in theory. Metroid establishes the idea of a fully interconnected world gated by abilities. You find the morph ball and suddenly narrow passages make sense. You get bombs and the floor itself becomes open for opportunities. Missiles act like keys rather than just ammo. This loop of explore, upgrade, reinterpret the world is the backbone of the entire Metroidvania genre, not just Metroid, and you could feel how revolutionary it was at the time. The problem is that Metroid on the NES pushes that structure through hardware limitations that actively fight the player. Zebes is built out of heavily reused tiles, and entire sections of the game look nearly identical. Bridstar in particular feels like a looping nightmare of blue corridors where it's generally difficult to tell whether you're progressing or just retracing your steps. When people describe getting lost in Metroid as mysterious or atmospheric, that is sometimes true, but a lot of the time it's just simply confusion caused by visual repetition. The game isn't always teaching you how to read the environment, but it wants you to memorize it without a map. Well, that's not entirely accurate. There was a map with it, just not actually in the game. Progression makes that problem worse, because Metroid loves hiding critical paths behind bombable walls, destructible ceilings, and fake floors with little to no visual indication. Sometimes you notice a subtle hint and feel clever for finding it. Other times you're bombing every tile because you've exhausted every visible option and the game is giving you nothing else to work with. That's where the experience starts to feel less like exploration and more like guesswork. Like there's a fine line between encouraging curiosity and forcing brute force trial and error, and I feel like the original Metroid crosses that line more often than people like to admit. Combat doesn't smooth over these frustrations either. Samus feels slow and floaty in a way that later games' movement lacks precision, aiming is stiff, and enemy placement often feels designed to harass rather than challenge. Death is especially punishing because when you die you respawn with almost no energy, which means the game immediately shifts you into survival mode instead of learning mode. Instead of thinking about routes or upgrades, you're just scrambling to rebuild health without getting hit by random enemies. That kind of punishment loop was common in the 80s, but it stacks poorly on top of a game that already demands so much memorization and patience. Despite all that, Metroid still succeeds where it counts most. The atmosphere. The isolation works, the music, just sparse and unsettling, gives Zebes a personality even with very limited hardware. The lack of NPCs or dialogue reinforces the feeling that you're somewhere abandoned and dangerous. Boss encounters act as milestones, even if they are mechanically simple. Kraid and Ridley may not be complex fights, but they do feel important in context. Mother Brain especially stands out as a memorable final confrontation, and the escape sequence afterward establishes a series tradition that still hits decades later. Beating the final boss though isn't enough because you do have to survive the aftermath. The ending twist revealing that Samus was a woman is still talked about today as one of the biggest early twists in gaming, and players were just pushed to learn the game's layout, optimize routes, and move faster. Metroid didn't invent speedrunning, but it absolutely encouraged that mindset before it had a name. So when people ask if the original Metroid is really that good, the honest answer depends on what you mean. As a foundation, it is incredible. Historically, it's essential, but as a modern play experience, it's rough, I feel like this is the type of game you respect more than you enjoy for most people. It's a proof of concept that later entries refine into something far more polished. Like, I feel like Metroid fans should still play this just to understand where the series started, and I feel like we can also look at it with the context of when it came out, but that doesn't excuse the fact that this game is just very limited compared to pretty much all the games that came after it. You will have people argue that this is one of the best games of all time. You'll have people argue that this should be ranked as one of the highest Metroid games, and I personally strongly disagree with that. I think this gave us a great formula that was just improved upon in pretty much every game. Before I get to the next game, subscribe if you think we need a new 2D Metroid game on the Switch too. After Metroid proved there was something compelling about getting lost on an alien planet, Nintendo had a very different problem on its hands. How do you make a sequel to a game built around exploration when you're moving to the original Game Boy? This is early 90s handheld hardware we're talking about, so tiny screen, monochrome visuals, limited audio, and a control setup that already struggled with precision platforming. Metroid 2 wasn't designed because Nintendo thought this is the ideal platform for an atmospheric exploration game. It was designed because the Game Boy was a massive success, and Nintendo wanted one of its more serious franchises represented there. So instead of trying to recreate the exact structure of the NES game, the developers pivoted. They kept the tone, they kept Samus, they kept the idea of isolation, but they changed the core goal entirely. Instead of exploring Zebes freely, Metroid 2 gives you a mission. Go to SR388 and wipe out the Metroids. All of them. No pirates, no bigger conspiracy up front, just getting rid of the Metroids. That alone did set this game apart immediately, and it explains a lot about how it feels to play. On paper, Metroid 2 is actually doing some interesting things. Progression is no longer about finding specific upgrades to unlock new areas. Instead, the game tracks how many Metroids you've killed, and once you clear them out of a region, environmental barriers recede and let you go deeper underground. Structurally, it's a big change. It makes the game more linear and more focused, which is probably a necessary compromise on a system where constantly getting lost would be even more miserable than it already was. It also reframes Samus' role in a way the first game didn't. Instead of just infiltrating a base, you're trying to erase the Metroids. The problem is that the Game Boy simply cannot support the kind of experience Metroid 2 is trying to deliver. The screen is small, Samus takes up a huge portion of it, and your field of view is painfully limited. Enemies appear almost on top of you, and navigation becomes exhausting because you can't see enough of your surroundings to build a mental map. Everything is rendered in similar shades of gray and green, which means entire sections blur together visually. But when you get lost in Metroid 2, it's not like it's mysterious or tense like in future games, it's just very frustrating. You're not thinking about the environment as a place, you're thinking about which identical cave you've already checked on and which ones you haven't. There's still no in-game map, which feels borderline cruel on a handheld. Even with a more structured progression, it's incredibly easy to lose your sense of direction, especially when backtracking through areas that all look the same. Combat doesn't save it either. Metroid 2 introduces the idea of Metroid evolution, Alpha, Gamma, Zeta, Omega, and conceptually that's one of the most important things that the series has ever done. It gives the Metroids a life cycle and makes them feel like an actual species instead of floating obstacles, and lays the groundwork for basically every story beat that comes after this game. The issue is how that plays out moment to moment. You fight a lot of Metroids, like a lot, and while the different forms technically behave differently, the fights start to blend together after a while. Early on, encountering a new form feels tense and dangerous, but later it just feels like busy work. The game leans heavily on repetition, and because the environments don't vary much, the hunts just don't feel distinct. It feels like you're just repeating a pattern until the counter goes down enough. There are some genuine improvements over the first game. Metroid 2 introduces save stations, which is a huge quality of life upgrade, and honestly the bare minimum for a game like this. Samus also gets new abilities like the Spider Ball and the Spring Ball, which add some variety to movement, even if they're clunky by modern standards. The sound design is very limited, and some may argue that it actually works in the game's favor, but there are long stretches with minimal music and just ambient noise, and while that may reinforce the feeling that SR388 is empty, hostile, and slowly being stripped of life, I personally think it's trying to do a little too much there. Where Metroid 2 really earns its place in the series though is its ending, and spoiler alert for this game if you haven't played it. After you kill the Queen Metroid, a legitimately imposing final boss for the platform, the game pulls back and gives you one last moment that recontextualizes everything you've done. The baby Metroid hatches, imprints on Samus, and instead of attacking, follows her. Samus spares it, and that single choice adds depth to her character in the way the first game never even attempted. It shows that Samus isn't just a killing machine, but she is capable of mercy. It's a quiet moment, but it was one of the most important moments in the entire franchise for the story, and this decision would affect events in future games. So Metroid 2 is a weird game to evaluate. It is critical to the series' identity and story, but it's also one of the least enjoyable entries to actually play today. Most of its problems aren't about bad ideas, it's about execution just being limited by the hardware. The game definitely wants to be atmospheric, but its visuals make navigation completely exhausting. So is Metroid 2 really that good? Historically and narratively for a Metroid game? Absolutely. As a modern play experience, not really. This is a game like the original that you appreciate more than you enjoy, and it is very telling that when people talk about loving Metroid 2, they're often talking about its remakes instead. Samus Returns and AM2R exist because the core ideas here deserve better execution. I'm not saying this game is bad, but unless you grew up with the Game Boy, it is very hard to get into this game. By the early 1990s, Metroid was in a strange position. The first game had introduced a radical idea that helped shape how people thought about exploration in video games, but it was also brutally unfriendly. The second game expanded the lore in meaningful ways, but hardware limitations held it back so hard that it became more respected than loved. So when Super Metroid was announced for the Super Nintendo, this was Nintendo's chance to prove that the Metroid concept actually worked when paired with the right technology and a clear design philosophy. And this time, they had the hardware, the experience, and frankly the pressure to get it right. The SNES allowed for larger worlds, better sound, detailed sprites, and much smoother controls, and Super Metroid feels like a team finally being allowed to execute the vision they've been trying to do since 1986. From the very beginning, Super Metroid understands presentation in a way the earlier games couldn't. The opening sequence doesn't rush you. You get a recap of the first two games, reminding you of the baby Metroid and setting the tone with that now iconic line about peace in the galaxy. Then you arrive at the research station, only to find it destroyed, the scientist dead, and Ridley standing there like he's insulting you. And that entire intro sequence is deliberate. It's a very quiet cinematic moment that sort of set the tone for what this game would be, even though there wouldn't really be many cinematic moments here. When you land on Zebes again, Super Metroid does something brilliant. It uses that familiarity, but completely changes it up. You revisit locations from the first game, but they're changed, abandoned, or corrupted. The game doesn't explain this to you, but it lets you feel it. The sense of returning to a place that remembers you and resents you is one of Super Metroid's greatest strengths. This is where the series fully commits to environmental storytelling, because in previous games, graphics just weren't there yet to really tell a visual story, but here with the 16-bit graphics they were. And I gotta say, I replayed this a couple months ago, and it still looks beautiful. Mechanically, Super Metroid is where everything finally clicks. Samus controls better than ever, even if she is still a bit floaty compared to modern standards. The ability to aim diagonally alone feels like a revelation compared to earlier entries. The addition of the speed booster and shine spark opens up movement in a way that rewards the player for actually learning it. The beam system, which allows upgrades to stack instead of replace each other, gives Samus a lot more control here. Instead of just feeling like you're getting stronger, you just feel how absurdly powerful Samus becomes as you get more health, as you get more missile capacity, as you get more upgrades. And then perhaps the most important addition here, Super Metroid finally gives you a map. And this cannot be overstated, because the inclusion of an in-game map changes everything. We take it for granted nowadays, but it just makes this a much more pleasant experience. You'll still get lost here, but it doesn't feel like you're completely lost. It feels more like a puzzle than punishment, because you're still making informed decisions about where you're going and not just wandering around blindly. The game still hides secrets, but they're a lot easier to spot here and it feels a lot fairer. The level design is where Super Metroid earns its legendary reputation. Each area is visually distinct, mechanically unique, and has its own theme. For example, the wreck ship is an all-time great section. It's dark, silent, and haunted until you restore power, at which point it becomes a lot more hostile. And once again, Super Metroid doesn't have to rely on dialogue or exposition to communicate tone, but it lets the environment do the work, and it works perfectly here. Boss fights in Super Metroid also strike a perfect balance between being a sort of spectacle and also functioning really well. Kraid's reveal, where the screen literally expands to accommodate his size, is still iconic. Ridley is fast, aggressive, and punishing here as you would expect. And then Mother Brain's return is, in my opinion, one of the toughest moments in the game. I had to try this multiple times before I actually finished it. And then the final battle, I mean, for what they did on an SNES game, and spoiler alert here if you haven't played it, you're getting attacked and there's nothing you can do, you just have to have enough health. And then the baby Metroid saves Samus, sacrificing himself, and then leads to the escape moment here, which, while not too difficult, is still super stressful. That said, Super Metroid isn't flawless, and pretending it is does the discussion a disservice. Samus's movement, while revolutionary at the time, can feel floaty and slightly imprecise today. Wall jumping and advanced techniques are never explicitly taught, which is clever from a design standpoint, but also means many players simply never learn them without external knowledge. Some progression moments still rely on hidden blocks that can halt momentum if you miss a subtle clue. And in terms of difficulty, Super Metroid is actually fairly forgiving once you collect enough energy tanks, which can make large portions of the late game feel less threatening than intended. And also I do just want to say, with the wall jumps, you do see the creatures demonstrate it for you, but I still had a lot of problems with it at first. But these are minor criticisms in the context of what Super Metroid accomplishes. This is the game that really defined the genre. It's not the reason Metroidvania exists as a term, but it is definitely what popularized it. Even though this game came out over 30 years ago now, it still holds up and is still an all-time classic. So is Super Metroid really that good? Yes. As someone who did not play this until fairly recently, like the past few years, I really love this game. Like, I've tried to play it when I was younger, but I didn't really appreciate it. But when I finally locked in and said I want to finish this game, it didn't take me long at all. I just wanted to keep playing through because the game was that good. Even though newer games may look better and may control a little better, in my opinion this is probably still the best 2D Metroid game ever. Which is saying something because there's some fantastic games in this series. After Super Metroid, the series essentially vanished. 8 years passed with no new entry, which in gaming time might as well be a generation. By the early 2000s, Metroid had become less of an active franchise and more of just a classic. It was something people talked about in the best games ever conversations, but not something Nintendo really seemed enthusiastic to continue. When Metroid finally came back in 2002, it did so in a very Nintendo way, by splitting the audience straight down the middle. On almost the same day, Nintendo released Metroid Prime, which was a full 3D reinvention on the GameCube, and Metroid Fusion, which was the long-awaited continuation of the 2D storyline. Prime got the spotlight, the marketing push, and got a ton of critical reception, but Fusion also did something great, but a lot quieter. Fusion wasn't designed as Super Metroid 2, it was designed as a response to Super Metroid's legacy. Nintendo knew they couldn't just remake the same structure and expect it to feel fresh after nearly a decade of fans talking about the original Super Metroid, so instead of leaning into total freedom, Fusion went in the opposite direction. It asked a very specific question: what if Samus isn't in control anymore? That idea drives everything about the game, from its story to its pacing to its most controversial design choices. Right from the opening minutes, Fusion strips Samus of her invincibility. She isn't just weakened in the usual Metroid way, she's broken, infected by the X-parasites on SR-388, nearly killed, surgically altered, and permanently changed by Metroid DNA. Samus starts the game literally fused with the thing she once hunted. I guess you could say there was some Metroid fusion here. Samus is no longer an unstoppable force. She's vulnerable, monitored, and constantly reminded that she's operating under someone else's authority. The fusion suit visually reinforces that. It's slimmer, less imposing, almost exposed compared to her classic armor. You feel weaker before you even take control here. This is also the first time Metroid really commits to story as an active presence. Samus narrates her thoughts, the onboard computer speaks to her, objectives are explicitly given, the game tells you where to go and why, and that was very jarring for longtime fans who love Super Metroid's silence and ambiguity, and even the first two games, which were even more ambiguous. Fusion doesn't want you to wander aimlessly, it wants you moving forward, following orders, uncovering a mystery piece by piece. The BSL station itself reflects that philosophy, segmented into sectors, each with a clear function and theme, making the world feel more artificial and controlled than Zebes ever did. It is intentional. This isn't a natural planet you're exploring, it's a space station that's actively working against you. Mechanically, Fusion is tight. Samus controls better than she ever has at this point. Movement is faster, it's more responsive, and more modern than Super Metroid, even if it sacrifices some of that floaty freedom. Ledge grabbing alone feels like a massive quality of life improvement. Combat is sharper, and boss fights are more technically demanding than anything the series had done before, but the structure surrounding that gameplay is where Fusion becomes divisive. The navigation rooms explicitly tell you where your next objective is, doors lock behind you, entire sections of the station become inaccessible until the story allows it. It's not an accident or limitation, but it's a design choice. Fusion wants to control pacing in a way no previous Metroid had ever attempted. That control is what allows Fusion to introduce one of the most effective ideas in the series, the SAX. The SAX is genius because it's Samus at full power roaming the station while you're not. Suddenly the most dangerous thing in the game looks exactly like you, moves like you, and has weapons you can't counter. When it appears, the music drops out, the screen shakes, and the game forces you to run or hide. These moments are rare, but they're unforgettable. Fusion doesn't overuse them, which is why they work. The tension comes from knowing you can't win, not yet at least. It's one of the few times a 2D Metroid game actually feels like survival horror. That said, Fusion's strengths are also its limitations. The linearity never fully disappears. Even when the game loosens up near the end, you're still operating within a fairly narrow path compared to Super Metroid or later entries. Exploration exists, but it's secondary. You're not asking where can I go so much as how do I get where the game clearly wants me to go. For some players that's a deal breaker. Metroid to them is about discovering on your own and having this big planet that you can go anywhere you want to. And Fusion simply isn't interested in giving you that experience. But there are also a lot of people who either prefer this or still don't mind it because it is a very great curated adventure. And the writing, while effective, can also feel heavy-handed at times. The computer's dialogue, especially once it takes on the personality of Adam, does add a little more context, but it also removes some of the ambiguity that made earlier games have that distinct feeling. Samus is more human here, more expressive, and more openly defiant by the end, particularly when she realizes the Federation's intentions are far from noble. That character development is compelling, but it does come at the cost of mystery. Fusion tells you what to think more often than previous games ever did. Still, it's hard to deny how well Fusion executes the Division. The atmosphere is oppressive, the pacing is relentless, boss fights are memorable and often grotesque. The X-Parasite as an enemy concept is far more unsettling than the Metroids ever were, because it turns familiar creatures into more unpredictable threats. I'm not going to spoil the ending here because I feel like less people have played this compared to the previous games, but it is one of the better ones in the series. So is Metroid Fusion really that good? Yes, but with conditions. It's excellent at what it's trying to be, even if what it's trying to be isn't what everyone wanted. It sacrifices freedom for a more focused experience. If you like Super Metroid, I think there's a good chance you'll like Metroid Fusion, but you may not like its more linear feel. More importantly though, Fusion sets the stage for everything that comes after it. Its story, its themes, and its ideas don't just exist in isolation. Ideas from this game show up in future Metroid games. I really like Metroid Fusion. I think it's a fantastic game, but I wouldn't say it's my favorite. By the time Zero Mission was in development, Nintendo had a very clear understanding of two things. First, the original Metroid was historically important, but just borderline unapproachable for modern players. And second, Fusion had proven that 2D Metroid still worked, even if it did divide fans. Zero Mission exists in between that. It wasn't made because Nintendo thought we need another remake. It was made because the series had reached a point where its origin story no longer reflected what Metroid actually was. It's like the NES game was a prototype, and Zero Mission was Nintendo going back and fully realizing the vision of what the original Metroid just couldn't do with the technology at the time. Unlike Fusion, Zero Mission doesn't try to reinvent Metroid, it tries to perfect it. The goal is to retell Samus's first mission using the refined mechanics, readability, and pacing that had evolved over nearly 2 decades. That's why Zero Mission feels immediately familiar if you've played Super Metroid or Fusion. Samus moves fast, controls are responsive, ledge grabbing is here, combat flows smoothly. The difference is that Zero Mission deliberately removes Fusion's heavy-handed guidance. You're not being told where to go every 5 minutes. Chozo statues might nudge you in a general direction, but most of the time you're free to explore, backtrack, and sequence break. And it feels like this is Nintendo just trying to give more player agency back. What's impressive is how well Zero Mission teaches without teaching. The map is carefully constructed so that new players can kind of be eased into it, while experienced players can break that flow almost immediately. You can tell this game was built with speedrunners and veterans in mind. Techniques like wall jumping, bomb jumping, and early item acquisition are more than possible, but they're even encouraged. The game quietly acknowledges advanced play by rewarding with alternate routes and faster progression instead of punishing it. That sense of respect for player skill is one of Zero Mission's greatest strengths. Visually, Zero Mission is a massive step up from the NES original, obviously, but it also benefits from being developed late in the GBA's lifespan. The sprites are detailed, colorful, and expressive without losing any clarity. Zebes finally feels like a real place instead of a repeating maze. Areas are distinct, readable, and memorable. You could actually build a mental map of the world without needing external help, which does sound like a low bar, but compared to the original game, it does mean a lot. This alone makes Zero Mission the definitive way to experience Metroid's opening chapter. Then there's the moment where Zero Mission stops being just a remake and starts being something a lot more ambitious. After you defeat Mother Brain, the game doesn't end. Instead, Samus is shot down, stripped of her power suit entirely, and forced to infiltrate a space pirate facility in her Zero suit with only a weak stun gun. This section is controversial for a reason. It's slower, more fragile, and more restrictive than the rest of the game, but it's also one of the smartest additions Nintendo could have made. You're reminded how dangerous Zebes actually is when you're not a walking tank, and stealth-focused gameplay is tense but also doesn't overstay its welcome like you might be worried about. This extra chapter also deepens Samus as a character without relying on dialogue. You don't need narration to understand what's happening. All of this is just communicated through gameplay, and at its core, that is classic Metroid. If there's a criticism to be made, it's that Zero Mission is short, like very short. Even on a first playthrough, it can only take you like a few hours, and for experienced players, that can be even quicker. Some sections are easier than expected, and the game is generally less punishing than Super Metroid, but that does feel intentional. Zero Mission isn't trying to be an ultimate challenge. It feels like a better entry point into the series for players. So once again, I ask the question, is Zero Mission really that good? Yes, and in a very specific way. It's not the most atmospheric Metroid, and it's not the most challenging, but it is one of the most well-designed, and it's a perfect example of taking an old game that was very limited by its hardware and the time it came out, and fully realizing it into a fantastic remake. Like, this is a faithful remake, while also being like a new thing. By the time Samus Returns was announced, 2D Metroid had been dormant for something like 13 years. There had been Metroid games in that time. There were Prime games, there were spin-offs. There was Federation Force, which was a complete disaster both commercially, critically, and with the initial reaction from fans. But people missed 2D Metroid games. That's why when the fan remake Another Metroid II remake came out, people were raving about it. It was one of the best made fan games of all time. But then there was controversy with Nintendo shutting it down and a lot of people being very upset with Nintendo. And that led to controversy when Nintendo revealed at E3 2017 that a full remake of Metroid 2 was coming to the 3DS. There were fans who just would not buy this as a form of boycott against Nintendo, but there was also a lot of people who just wanted to buy this to support Metroid and not have this be the end of the series. Something else worth noting is that this came out on the 3DS in 2017 after the Switch came out, so that did definitely raise a lot of questions about why this wasn't saved for the Switch. But anyway, let's get back to the game itself. This wasn't a Retro Studios project, and it wasn't Nintendo EPD either. This game was largely developed by Mercury Steam, which is a Spanish studio best known for the Castlevania Lords of Shadow games. And those were titles that were divisive even among Castlevania fans. Giving them Metroid was a gamble, and Nintendo clearly treated Samus Returns as a proving ground. You could feel throughout the game, because while the game does respect the original Metroid 2, it sometimes feels a little too cautious. But that's not to say it doesn't change anything, far from it actually. Structurally, Samus Returns stays very close to Metroid 2's core idea. You're systematically eradicating Metroids to progress deeper into SR388 388, that fundamental loop remains intact, and honestly, it's both the game's biggest strength and its biggest limitation. On one hand, Mercury Steam massively improves the original's execution. As you'd expect, the environments are fully realized, the map is readable, and each Metroid encounter is now an actual fight instead of a repetitive chore. On the other hand, no amount of modernization can completely erase the fact that Metroid 2's design is inherently segmented. You clear an area, an earthquake happens, lava recedes, repeat. It's more structured than classic Metroid, and that linearity does remain throughout the game. Where Samus Returns really distinguishes itself is in combat. This is where the most debate comes from. The game has a melee counterattack, which is the defining mechanic. Enemies frequently telegraph attacks that you're expected to parry, opening them up for a flashy instant kill. The first few hours feel great, Samus feels powerful, reactive, and it flows pretty well, but the problem is that the game leans on the system constantly. Many enemies are just clearly designed around being countered, to the point where shooting them normally feels inefficient or just discouraged. It feels like there's just more of a rhythm to combat rather than just improvising. You just wait, counter, move on. It can be satisfying, but it also becomes repetitive, especially in longer play sessions. The combat focus subtly shifts how exploration feels. Earlier Metroid games let you decide how to engage, fight, avoid, or route around enemies. Samus Returns pushes you towards confrontation. SR388 feels less like a hostile ecosystem you're navigating, and more like a gauntlet of encounters you're meant to clear. That's not necessarily bad, but it is different, and longtime fans do notice this immediately. Metroid has always been about tension through isolation, but Samus Returns replaces that sometimes with the constant engagement. Now, this was the first Metroid game I actually played, at least the first one I really got into, so I didn't even know it when I first played it, but when I first played Super Metroid and the other 2D Metroid games, I definitely did prefer that style. But there's more to talk about here. The new Aeon abilities are a mixed bag. Most of them land well, Scan Pulse reveals hidden blocks, and that was controversial, but I don't mind it. Obviously, we had something similar in Super Metroid. It doesn't solve puzzles for you, it just saves you from pixel hunting every wall. Phase Drift and Beam Burst add variety to combat and movement, and Lightning Armor gives you a temporary safety net when things get chaotic. None of them redefine Metroid, but they do give the game its own identity. Boss design is where Samus Returns shines the most. The Metroid evolutions are far more dynamic than in the original, and the added bosses do have some really good standout moments. Visually, the game is solid, but it's not anything too memorable. The 2.5D art style looks good on the 3DS, especially with the depth effect, but it doesn't have the timeless pixel identity of Super or Zero Mission or Fusion. The environments are detailed, but they can blur together, and the soundtrack leans more ambient than memorable like the original Metroid 2. Nothing's bad here, but it doesn't really stick with you the same way as other games. If Samus Returns struggles anywhere, it's the pacing. The game can feel long, not because it's bloated, but because its core loop doesn't evolve dramatically until late in the experience. You're just doing variations of the same thing for a while, and while the combat stays mechanically sound, the sense of discovery just doesn't escalate as sharply as other games. So do I think Samus Returns is really that good? Yeah, I think it's a very good game, with caveats. It's a very thoughtful, well-made remake that we did need because Metroid 2 had aged pretty badly, and this is definitely a game that most Metroid fans will have a good time with. However, there are issues that I mentioned. The game really pushing you towards just countering every enemy and having a formulaic feel definitely does hamper the experience a little bit, and you'll have a lot of people tell you another Metroid 2 remake is better. I've never played that in full, so I couldn't give you my opinions on that, but this was definitely a very good way for me to actually get into the Metroid series and become a big fan of the other games. And finally, we arrive at Metroid Dread. For years, Metroid Dread was rumored, and a lot of fans thought it just wasn't coming. And then somehow, after Samus Returns performed well enough to justify another attempt, Nintendo finally made this. Because remember, before this, we hadn't gotten a brand new original 2D Metroid adventure since Fusion, all the way back in the Game Boy Advance. Metroid Samus Returns was a remake, so not a completely new adventure, so people were waiting for a very long time for this. This game was clearly made for longtime fans of the series. It doesn't ease you in. It just throws Samus onto ZDR, strips her abilities almost immediately, and introduces a threat that doesn't care how long you've played Metroid. The robots are not impressed by how long you've played Metroid or how many times you've speedran Super Metroid, and that is very intentional. Dread is designed to challenge the idea that Metroid is slow, floaty, or outdated. It's a very fast game and feels very modern. From a mechanical standpoint, this is the most refined Samus has ever felt. Everything Mercury Steam experimented within Samus Returns is tightened here. The melee counter is still present, but no longer the centerpiece. You can counter while moving or ignore it. It's entirely if your positioning and aim are good. Free aiming is seamless. Sliding replaces some morph ball usage, keeping momentum high. Flash shift adds an entirely new layer to movement, letting skilled players reposition instantly midair. Like, this is the best movement has ever felt in a Metroid game by far. ZDR isn't as openly freeform as something like Super Metroid, but it is far from Fusion's hallway structure. The game subtly funnels you forward using one-way paths, collapsing floors, and environmental locks, but it really feels like you're being told what to do. Instead, you feel like the world is reacting to you. Sometimes that design choice can frustrate you, like you hear a lot of complaints about this, but most of the time it actually does do well with the pacing. Dead time is minimized, and you're almost always doing something interesting, whether it's learning a new ability, doing some traversal trick, or just fighting against an enemy that can be a little bit of a challenge. The enemy zones are the most controversial element here, and also the most misunderstood. They're not horror set pieces in the traditional sense. The point isn't to scare you with jump scares, it's to force you to move decisively. Enemies punish hesitation. If you freeze up, you die. If you panic, you die. If you move with intent, you survive. The minuscule counter window when an enemy grabs you isn't there to be reliable, but it's there to train you to not rely on it. Once you learn that, the encounters definitely shift to be a little less stressful. Boss design in Dread is where the game really earns its reputation. The fights are demanding, but they're fair in a way that feels almost like old school Metroid. Every attack has a tell, every pattern can be learned. Death rarely feels cheap. The game also respects your time while having you improve. That can be an issue in some other games where it feels like it just wants you to get lost just to pad, and Dread does a really good job like not having that feeling. Narratively, Dread finally pays off threads that have been around since Fusion. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything here, but there's things here about the X-Parasites, the Metroid DNA, the Galactic Federation's questionable ethics, and all of it is part of this game. If there's a weakness to Dread, it is its atmosphere variety. The environments are well designed, but some areas blend together visually, and the soundtrack is more functional than iconic. Like, you probably won't walk away singing any of these tracks. So, is Metroid Dread, the most recent 2D Metroid game, really that good? I would say absolutely. By a lot of people, this is considered to be the best Metroid game or the best 2D Metroid game, just because it's super fun to play. I don't think it has the same environment or some of the same memorable moments as Super Metroid, but the movement here in this game just feels worlds better, where Super Metroid definitely feels a little clunkier. And then, of course, the aiming here, the modern design choices where you don't have to press a button 5 times to select what kind of missile you want to use. It's overall a better experience in that regard, and at times I've thought Dread was better than Super. Right now, I'd say Super is a little better in my opinion, but I think it's closer than a lot of people think. Dread is also the best-selling 2D Metroid game, and I think it may actually be the best-selling Metroid game of all time. And that's a great sign because that means Nintendo's probably working on a 2D Metroid as we speak. Whether it comes out this year in 2026 or 2027, I think it's a pretty safe bet to say we're going to get one on the Switch too. We of course did get Metroid Prime 4 at the end of last year, so I wouldn't really expect a 2D Metroid this year, but who knows? So after going through all this, I think the more interesting question isn't are the 2D Metroid games good, but why have they stayed relevant for nearly 40 years when so many other Nintendo series from the same era either were completely changed, forgotten, or simply just fell off. Metroid never chased trends, and while there's been different experiences, like you had the more linear Metroid Fusion, for the most part that same Metroid formula has been repeated in every 2D game. I think Metroid and Metroid 2 aren't great games. I don't think they're games a lot of people who didn't grow up with them will enjoy, but they did create the outline for what would become some truly fantastic games. Super Metroid is an all-time great. Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission are two of the Game Boy Advance's best games. Samus Returns was a great remake, and Metroid Dread is one of the best games on the Switch. So yes, to answer the question in the video, yes, the 2D Metroid games are that good, for the most part at least. Let me know your favorite Metroid game in the comments, and also let me know, do you want to see a video like this on the Prime games? Be sure to subscribe and join my Discord. Thank you for watching Domainy, and I'll see you next time.